Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our featured guest today is Jade Wallace. Jade Wallace is a writer from the Niagara Fruit Belt, currently living just south of the Detroit River and just north of Lake Erie. Wallace's writing has won the Muriel's Journey Poetry Prize and Coastal Shelf's Funny and Poignant Poetry Contest, placed third in the Ken Belford Poetry Contest, has been a finalist for the Wergle Flomp Humour Poetry Prize, and has been nominated for the Journey Prize. They are the author of several solo and collaborative chapbooks, the reviews editor for CAROUSEL Magazine, and the co-founder of Made, a collaborative writing entity. Love is a Place, But You Cannot Live There is their first full book. Welcome back to the show, Jade.
Thank you so much for having me, not once, but twice. It is an honor.
It's our pleasure. So congratulations on this first big book. Although you've written for journals and chapbooks, what was it about this process that was different for you, do you think?
The time. It took me a while to get it together. I've been writing in a loose sense for a long time, but it's been about 13 or so years since my first chapbook came out. And not to say I haven't written full-length books prior to this, I have, although hopefully they will never see the light of day. So I found, like, with chapbooks, it was pretty easy to get, 10 or so poems together and sort of be like, this is a chapbook, it's going to be a little limited edition run and whatever. But I think there's a certain pressure with one's first book to try to make it something worthwhile, deserving of, whatever it is, 500 copy print run and a full-length publication and all of that. So I had, certainly written books worth of material before, but it wasn't until I started to conceptualize a sort of guiding principle for actually putting a large number of poems together in one collection that I really felt like there was a book there and not just a random assemblage of pages I'd written. Which apparently takes me a long time. I know some people are like 22 and their first book's out, and that's wonderful for them. I am not that type. Things take me a while to acclimate to and get my mind around and whatnot. So this was a while in the making, and that for me was the biggest defining feature of a book as opposed to a chapbook.
What was it like with from the editorial process, working with an editor for that extended process time?
I've definitely had some experience working with editors here and there, typically not on full manuscripts, obviously, but I'd say it was very similar. And I think part of that is my fault in a sense, because I tend to go into a manuscript with already, well, I suppose not go into. By the time the manuscript is assembled, I have a very clear idea of like the sections and the ordering and what sort of the driving impulses are behind it and all of that. So by the time it's a manuscript and before the editor even sees it, I'm pretty clear on what I want it to be. And I know that's certainly not the case for all writers. I mean, I've heard of a lot of writers, especially with their first collection, kind of having like a grab bag, if you will, of poems, and then an editor really helps them assemble it. And I didn't want that. I'm stubborn and stubborn over again. So I tend to have very clear ideas about what I want, and I go in, and then like the editorial process in this case was very much about just sort of ensuring there were no extraneous bits in the collection, that it was cohesive, and that the individual poems were working as effectively as they could be. So it was a bit more of like just a cleanup process rather than any kind of radical reimagining of the collection. And so in that sense, for me, it was very much like my previous sort of editing, my more limited editing experiences.
Location and place are an overarching trope throughout this work, whether ghost towns of Ontario, a few days in New York, or New Brunswick. What is it about a sense of place that draws you to write about it?
Oh, I'm very drawn to the atmospheric in general. I love sort of the vibes is definitely the wrong word, but the kind of nebulous energy and sense and emotional resonance that one gets from a place that are very hard to locate. Like, I think a lot of times when we have like a lot of emotional resonance with something, it's like a human relationship or something like that, like something that's easier to pin down why we're getting this sort of resonance from it. I think places can be a little bit mysterious, and it like in a way that borders on the spiritual for me. And I'm not particularly a spiritual person, but I find there's like a sense of, oh, for lack of a better word, I can't help but thinking of like what Freud called the sort of oceanic feeling that one gets, like this overwhelm with like the entirety of existence that I find when you go into a place, whether it's like a natural space or a large metropolis or whatever it is, it's like easy to be like overwhelmed, and you realize how small you are and how how vast everything is around you, and you get like this kind of sense of awe. And I find that certain places in particular are really evocative in that way. And so yeah, it's like I guess that the way I used to feel when going to church back when I was religious, like that's kind of it's a similar experience for me.
Well, you talked a little bit about having a very clear idea of the sections and how you wanted things arranged in the book. And it's divided into sub-themes like the breakdown of a relationship, extended family, meeting family members of a new love. What was it about these particular topics that you wanted to explore? What drew you to those?
Well, I have to say this book, because it was sort of, I'll loosely categorize it as my like 20s writing. I am in my 30s now, so it feels I know it's an arbitrary distinction, and yet I feel like there's a hint of truth there. So my quote unquote 20s writing was very much characterized by like self-investigation, I guess I would say, where you're really trying to suss out like who you are as a person in relation to others, because I think that's the way most of us self-define. And so a lot of the poetry I was writing at the time was similarly very self-reflexive, very much about plumbing the depths of one's own interiority or whatever. And so I think that's totally what you see in the poems. They're very much poems that are about like constantly, they're not just about me, but they're constantly defining me as a person in relation to other people and places and the experiences I was having. And a lot of these are very much autobiographical works. Or if they're not autobiographical, it's like there's something I secondhand witnessed or something like that. And so I guess like I would contrast that with what I would call my 30-something writing, which is very much about like an interest in larger concepts or social issues or whatever, like a kind of, I'm sick of writing about myself. I'm dying to write about something that's not me. And that's sort of the direction it's gone after this book. But this book is still very much like me focused. And I feel like that was a necessary thing that I had to sort of go through in order to be able to also then write about these other subjects later. And I look back on the book, because I mean, these are all poems, honestly, that I wrote probably 2017 or earlier. Like these are 5-year-plus old poems for me. And so I no longer personally feel extremely close to them. Like they no longer represent my current experience of the world in any way. But at the time, it was just a reflection of what I was completely absorbed by. And so that was what I was writing about.
Environment and protection also plays a role in many of these poems. For example, animals in strange houses. You talk about how geese are pushed to roost in urban areas, and you gather the bones, talks about the decline of birds. You also reference Indigenous language and I am going to apologize for my pronunciation, in Humans Under Tenagahi, and issues of settlers forcing industrialization. Is this something that's important for you to convey in your poetry?
I would say yes. I grew up, as you mentioned in my bio, I grew up in the Niagara Fruit Belt, and so it's a very interesting area because the urban coexists very closely with the rural and even with the wild, essentially. And there's a lot of green space. I mean, the Niagara Fruit Belt is like part of the green belt, which I feel compelled to mention is currently under threat because of our current provincial government. But I suppose just being surrounded constantly by the agricultural, but then also the wild is maybe a stretch. They're very much spaces that humans have invaded in many ways. But these, like the more wild, I guess, in contrast to an urban space, obviously. Anyways, to get to the point of the question, being so closely involved with like plant and animal life that is not wholly dictated by humans, I feel really makes you sensitive to that sort of thing. And it did for me anyways. And I noticed it particularly, I suppose, when I actually left Niagara and went to Toronto and was in like an urban space that is so dictated by human whims. And I really keenly missed having proximity to spaces where humans didn't really fully control things. Like there were, flora and fauna doing their thing, and it was slightly beyond human control in a way. And so it's just been a preoccupation. Like every time I go back to Niagara to visit my parents, I'm just completely mesmerized by the amount of like quote unquote natural life there. And so every time I also consequently go into any other space, like elsewhere in Ontario, as you mentioned, or New Brunswick or wherever it is, I tend to notice those same things, like things that remind me, I guess, probably of the place where I came from. And that very thing, which I'm obviously so engaged by, is under threat constantly, because humans are constantly trying to take over everything and resource extract and all of that. And so it feels both very precious and extremely precarious. And so even when I'm not trying to write about that, it ends up in there because I'm constantly noticing it around me, I think.
What do you think we can learn from talking about the environment and environmental issues in art?
Oh, I would honestly love for humans to just like lay off a bit, like sit back, stop trying to progress, just like relax and be nice to each other for a while instead of constantly trying to like expand empire and all of that terrible stuff. Like, to go back to what you said about, there's like these moments in the collection where I obviously do talk about colonialism, and it's with a certain self-consciousness because I'm obviously like, settler, or like embroiled in settler culture, despite my best intentions. And yeah, I think it's a bit of a pipe dream, but I would love if humans would just scale back on their like industrial and technological progressions a little bit. I mean, focus on, making sure people are fed and things like that, the more basic needs, instead of constantly trying to be capitalists.
You made some really interesting choices around style and formatting. For example, in Prevailing Currents, talking about the reversing falls in New Brunswick, the typesetting literally steps out of sync. What were your thoughts behind choosing free verse, and did you experiment with other poetic forms?
Yes and no. So free verse definitely is, I think, basically the only mode I use in this collection, which is very different from the way I started writing poetry and even the way I write poetry now. I started writing poetry, it was very traditional rhyming poetry. This is when I was like very young. But I eventually wanted to step outside of that. And rather than becoming experimental with form, I was just like, fuck form. I don't want to think about it. No rhymes, no anything. And I really fixated on like the content of the poetry and like they're kind of quasi-narrative poems, I think, here. And I was very fixated on narrative and character development, which sounds weird in a poem, but that's what I was focused on. And since then, I've sort of mitigated that position a little bit, and I try to incorporate some more traditional formal elements with more experimental or informal elements. But when I was writing this collection, I was, very much trying to find like a voice that wasn't that wasn't super invested in any kind of more determined sort of form. Like I didn't want to write sonnets because sonnets have such a loaded history, or villanelles or whatever, all these like forms, haiku, they all have extremely rich histories. And because this is, as I mentioned previously, a sort of more self-reflexive collection for me, I felt very contrarian and resistant to any kind of real formality. So I think that explains sort of the preoccupation with free verse, but nevertheless, I was still interested in thinking about it as poetry. So obviously, like, there are just elements of poetry you really can't get away from. There are, line breaks, because even if you choose not to use line breaks, they still haunt you. And things like that, like formatting on the page, like where it appears. So you mentioned the prevailing currents, where, for anyone who hasn't seen the poem, there's a portion of the poem that's left justified, and then another portion of the poem that's right justified, as if like the poem is almost fighting with itself over its form. And I know some people don't like that kind of odd type setting. I've heard people like they hate center justified, they hate right justified, and all of that. And I was young and I did not care about those arguments. And I was like, it makes sense to me that things would just be, the poem would reflect so visually what's actually happening in it, which is like this dialogic kind of conflict. So I'd say mostly that was a little bit of naivety, but like naivety can take us to some interesting places sometimes. So I appreciate my younger self for that.
So what was the influence of some of the other writers that you mentioned in this book? For example, Canadian writer Gary Barwin and classic Keats. How did they inspire you?
Well, I can answer those both fairly directly. I mean, Gary Barwin, I sort of mentioned only because I know him loosely. Like, we've corresponded at brief points over the years. He wrote an experimental review for CAROUSEL, for example. And as I'm the reviews editor of CAROUSEL, we obviously had a little bit of interaction around that. But mostly, I find he's like a very noticeable figure on the sort of Canadian literary scene, broadly speaking. And so that just happened to be like something he had said to me on social media, and it kind of stuck with me. And like, as I was writing the poem, I couldn't really get that vision of the bookstore out of my head, even after I'd been to the real bookstore and obviously had my own impressions of it and whatever. But yeah, he certainly can turn a memorable phrase sometimes, so I felt compelled to include that. John Keats, I like John Keats, but I constantly disagree with him. And I often feel compelled, I feel most compelled to write responses if I don't like something. So La Belle Dame sans merci was what I was responding to, for example, in The Mercy of Fairies. And it was really just because I was like, well, Keats has written this beautiful poem, and I completely don't relate to it at all. Like, this makes no sense to me. You are visited by this incredible, like, fairy woman person. And then all you can do afterwards is complain about it. That's ridiculous. And so I really wanted to write a poem in which the opposite of that happened, essentially, because I just thought it was such a silly poem for him to have written, as much as I admire his technical skill, which I think far exceeds mine. But there's a little bit of like petulance in it. And actually one of the first people who read this collection commented, and I don't know if they're meaning this as an insult or not, but they said there's a kind of meanness of spirit in some of these poems. And I was like, that's fair. There's like, I don't think I'm a mean person on the whole, and I don't think these are mean poems, but there's like a tiny little edge of resentment sometimes in the poems, for sure. And I think this is a good example of that. Like, I can like Keats and still, be a little bit mean to him, I guess.
Whose writing inspires you these days, do you think?
Oh, these days. Oh, that is a good question. I've been reading no Keats lately. A lot more contemporary. I don't want to say my peers, but people who are closer to my peers. They're writing now. They tend to be a little bit, situated more like me, like they're often in Canada, things like that. And part of that's just, again, doing the reviews editorship for Carousel. I do find myself reading a lot more of what's going on currently. I'm just trying to keep up with what's coming out and what, kind of deserves attention and all that. But the result is that I've been reading a lot more widely than I think I probably used to. And I now find it impossible to really point to who my major influences are at the moment. Like, there are certainly writers I like and am eager to read more of them, but I can't actually see their influence in my writing the way I used to be able to, I think. Yeah, so that's a hard question for me at the moment.
So what are you working on these days?
So these days, yes. So my second poetry collection, which is called The Work Is Done When We Are Dead, is nearly done, which I guess means we're almost dead. I don't like the logic of the title, I guess, but no, I'm pretty excited about it. I've been working on it basically ever since I stopped full-time writing this one. So the last 5 years, I've been pecking away at the second manuscript. Since we're a Windsor podcast, I feel compelled to mention that the Windsor Endowment for the Arts was kind enough to give me a little grant to work on it. And so it's really sort of pushed me towards getting it completed. And so as the title suggests, they're very much poems about labor and sort of exploring like what counts as labor and what how construing things as work can sometimes then affect our relationship to them. I mean, I think the easiest example is like there's no end of discussion these days about like emotional labor and like what do we actually mean when we talk about emotional labor and which spheres is it appropriate to consider something emotional labor versus not. And so this is like one of sort of many labor related questions the collection really meditates upon. And it's certainly not just about, traditional like paid labor, but just about all the kinds of work we do, whether it's as artists or as activists or even in like just our individual relationships, like what are the kinds of work we do and to what extent is it useful and not useful to see these things as work versus like what else might we construe them as. So that's the one project. And then the other project, which is tentatively done, is just my novel, which I wrote as part of my master's thesis called Anomia. And I'm just still trying to figure out if there's any outstanding edits to make on it and also kind of submitting it to publishers. And I'm in that sort of liminal stage where I'm like, not quite sure what it is. I think it's maybe done mostly, but we'll see.
Would you like to read some of your work for our listeners?
Oh, yes, sure. So I guess it makes sense to read something from the forthcoming book. Well, maybe since we talked about, I don't think I read The Mercy of Fairies last time, but since we were just discussing it, I think I will read that so you can see in full view my pettiness about John Keats. The Mercy of Fairies. She smiled before she kissed me, teeth flashing like talismans. Misery left the room and closed the door behind. Her mouth tasted like meadowsweet, oak, and broom, as though she were the incarnation of the woman Math and Gwydion dreamed. Her skin burned with vervain under my hands as her apartment rose farther above the scent of night and cars and road-worn courage below. She took the cold lily from my brow and adorned me in blood-red roses. I want you now, she said, 4 words to finish the charm. Still, I did not linger in the circle of her room when she suggested that I go. I withdrew to the birds, beginning to sing in the hedge, and to the morning light inquiring how many rings the world could hold.
Jade Wallace, thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to hear you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.